The courthouse was buzzing with quiet murmurs as people shuffled in and out of the grand courtroom. The air was thick with tension, a mix of solemnity and anticipation that seemed to settle over everyone present. Among the crowd sat a young boy, no older than 9, his small frame dwarfed by the wooden bench. He clutched the edges of his chair, his feet barely brushing the floor, and his big, round eyes darted around the room with a mix of nervousness and determination. The judge, a poised woman in her mid-40s, took her place at the bench. Her nameplate read, Honorable Judge Lorraine Parker. Known for her sharp wit and unwavering fairness, she commanded respect effortlessly. As she glanced through the files before her, the weight of the case already seemed to rest on her shoulders. But nothing could have prepared her, or anyone else in the room, for what was about to unfold. The boy, Elijah, had been at the center of this case for weeks. He was bright, inquisitive, and unusually articulate for his age, yet there was a sadness about him that tugged at everyone's heartstrings. He had spent much of his life bouncing between foster homes, each one leaving its own set of scars. Now his case had reached a critical point, one that could decide his future forever. The room quieted as the judge began the proceedings. Elijah Carter, would you please stand? Her voice was steady, but there was a softness to it, as though she knew how much this moment mattered. Elijah stood, his small hands clasped in front of him, his eyes locking with hers. Elijah, she continued, today, we're here to determine what is in your best interest moving forward. I want you to know that your voice matters in this courtroom. If there's anything you'd like to say, this is your opportunity. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Elijah glanced at his caseworker, then at the rows of people watching, before finally fixing his gaze back on Judge Parker. He took a deep breath, his little chest rising and falling as though he were mustering every ounce of courage he had. And then, with a voice that was small yet unwavering, he spoke. Your Honor, I know you're my mom. The courtroom froze. Gasps rippled through the audience, and even the judge herself looked momentarily stunned. Her hand paused mid-air, the pen she was holding hovering above the paper. It was as if time itself had stopped, everyone hanging on the weight of Elijah's words. Judge Parker blinked, her composed demeanor faltering ever so slightly. Elijah, she said slowly, her voice tinged with a mix of confusion and curiosity. What did you just say? Elijah's eyes welled up, but he didn't waver. You're my mom, he repeated, louder this time, his voice echoing in the silent room. I know you are. The judge leaned back in her chair, clearly trying to process what she had just heard. The tension in the room was palpable, every person present holding their breath as they waited for her response. And then Elijah added something that sent chills down everyone's spine. You told me you'd find me, he said softly, his voice trembling but resolute. You promised. The room erupted into a flurry of whispers, the sheer gravity of his words sending shockwaves through the courtroom. Judge Parker's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. Was it recognition, shock, or something deeper? Before she could respond, the bailiff stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. Order in the courtroom. But no one could look away from the boy standing at the center of it all. His small frame radiating a truth he seemed to believe with every fiber of his being. Judge Parker finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but commanding nonetheless. Elijah, she said, her eyes locked onto his, we'll need to discuss this further. Her words hung in the air, leaving everyone, including Elijah, wondering what would happen next. The courtroom remained eerily still, save for the faint shuffle of papers and muffled whispers from the back rows. Judge Parker's usually unshakable composure seemed to waver as she stared at Elijah. She couldn't stop replaying his words in her mind. Asterisk, you told me you'd find me. You promised, asterisk. Her gaze lingered on the boy for a moment longer than she intended, and something about his face tugged at a memory she couldn't quite place. There was a familiarity in his eyes, something almost haunting. She quickly snapped out of her thoughts, clearing her throat as she tried to recenter herself. Let's take a short recess, she announced, her voice firm, but slightly uneven. 15 minutes. The gavel's crack echoed through the room, and the courtroom slowly came to life again as people whispered, speculated, and shuffled toward the exits. Elijah remained standing in the same spot, his eyes never leaving the judge. He didn't look confused or scared. If anything, he seemed calm, like he had said exactly what he needed to. Judge Parker gathered her papers, but her focus wasn't on them. As she stood, she avoided the boy's gaze and briskly walked toward her chambers. Once inside, she closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. "Lorraine, get a grip," she whispered to herself. But her mind was racing. The words Elijah had spoken weren't random. They weren't the kind of thing a child would just make up on the spot. His tone, his expression, it all felt too deliberate, too real. But how could that be? She had no children. She had no connection to this boy. And yet, Lorraine shook her head and walked to her desk. Opening the case file that had been sitting there for weeks, she scanned the details. Elijah Carter, age 9, placed in foster care at 4 years old after his mother disappeared. No father listed on record. Multiple failed placements. He was currently staying with a temporary family, but this hearing was supposed to determine his long-term guardianship. She flipped through the pages, looking for anything that might explain what had just happened. But there was nothing unusual, at least not on paper. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than what the file revealed. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Elijah had been led back to his seat by his caseworker, Mrs. Turner. She was a kind woman in her 50s, with a soft voice and a patient demeanor, but even she seemed rattled. She crouched down beside Elijah, speaking to him quietly. "Elijah, honey," she began, "what you said earlier, do you want to talk about that?" Elijah looked at her with those same determined eyes. "I don't need to talk about it. I know it's true." Mrs. Turner hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "But how do you know, sweetheart? Did someone tell you that? Or?" "No one told me," Elijah interrupted. "I just know. I've always known." Mrs. Turner sighed, unsure of how to respond. She had worked with many children over the years, but Elijah was different. He had a quiet strength about him, a wisdom that felt far beyond his years. And yet, he was still just a little boy who had been through more than most adults could imagine. Back in her chambers, Lorraine stared out the window, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. She couldn't shake the image of Elijah's face or the conviction in his voice. It wasn't just what he had said, it was the way he had said it. Asterisk, "You told me you'd find me," asterisk. The words felt like they belonged to another lifetime, one she couldn't quite reach. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the unease creeping into her chest. But then a memory surfaced, unbidden and blurry. She was younger, maybe in her early 30s, and she remembered standing in a hospital room. The details were fuzzy, like a dream she couldn't fully grasp, but there was a baby's cry, and someone was telling her something. Something important. Her eyes snapped open, and she shook her head again, harder this time. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "I'm imagining things." But the feeling wouldn't go away. The 15 minutes passed in what felt like seconds. The courtroom reconvened, and Lorraine took her seat at the bench. Her expression was composed again, but a closer look would reveal the faint tension in her jaw. "Elijah," she said, her voice steady, "thank you for sharing your thoughts earlier. I understand this is a difficult situation for you, but before we move forward, I need to ask you some questions." Elijah nodded, his small hands still clasped in front of him. "Can you tell me why you believe I'm your mother?" she asked carefully, her tone neutral but probing. Elijah took a deep breath. "Because you look like her," he said simply. "And I remember things. Not a lot, but little pieces, like your voice and your eyes. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true." The room was silent again, every eye on the boy and the judge. Lorraine leaned forward slightly, studying him. "Elijah, you were very young when you entered foster care. Are you sure you're not confusing me with someone else? Maybe someone you met a long time ago?" "No," Elijah said firmly. "It's you. I know it's you." Lorraine hesitated, her carefully constructed walls starting to crack. She glanced at Mrs. Turner, who looked just as stunned as everyone else. "Mrs. Turner," Lorraine said, her tone shifting to one of authority, I need you to provide any additional background information on Elijah's case, specifically regarding his biological family. Mrs. Turner nodded quickly, flipping through her own stack of papers. Of course, Your Honor, but I don't have much beyond what's already in the file. His mother disappeared when he was very young. No one has been able to locate her. Lorraine's heart raced, though she kept her face calm. And his father? Unknown, Mrs. Turner replied. There's no information in the records. Elijah spoke up again, his voice breaking through the tension. It's okay if you don't remember me yet, he said softly, looking directly at Lorraine. But I remember you. And I know you'll remember me too. His words sent another ripple through the room, and Lorraine felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't respond immediately, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured but tinged with something softer. We'll need more time to review everything before any decisions are made, she said, addressing the room but keeping her eyes on Elijah. The gavel came down again, signaling the end of the session, but for Lorraine, the real battle was just beginning. The courtroom cleared out slowly, the weight of what had just transpired leaving a strange hush over the space. Elijah walked out holding Mrs. Turner's hand, his small frame calm but resolute. Meanwhile, Judge Parker remained seated at the bench long after the room emptied, her thoughts tangled in ways they hadn't been in years. Back in her chambers, Lorraine stared at the case file again. She flipped through the pages, though she already knew there was nothing new to find. She couldn't stop thinking about Elijah's words. He wasn't just a scared kid lashing out or trying to get attention. He believed what he was saying with his whole heart, and that made it impossible for her to ignore. She tried to shake the thoughts away, but they lingered like a stubborn shadow. For years, she had focused on her career, pouring everything into becoming the judge she was today. Personal relationships had taken a backseat. She didn't even have family photos on her desk, just a neat stack of files and a couple of law books. So why did this boy feel like a crack in the foundation she had so carefully built? Later that night, after the courthouse emptied and the city lights blinked against the darkness, Lorraine sat alone in her apartment. The silence was heavy, and for the first time in a long while, she felt unsettled. She opened her laptop and began researching Elijah's case. She scoured every detail she could find, piecing together a timeline of his life in the foster system. The deeper she dove, the more questions she had. Why had his mother disappeared? Why was there so little information about her in the records? And why, of all people, did Elijah believe she was his mother? The coincidences felt too strange to ignore, yet she couldn't bring herself to believe it was possible. Across the city, Elijah sat in a small bedroom at his temporary foster home. It was tidy but sparse, with a single bed and a shelf filled with toys that didn't feel like his. He stared out the window, the glow of streetlights reflecting in his eyes. Mrs. Turner's words from earlier rang in his ears. Elijah, we'll figure this out together. But he didn't want to figure it out. He already knew the truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, crumpled photograph. It was the only thing he had from before he entered foster care. The image was faded, but it showed a woman holding a baby. Her face was hard to make out, but Elijah clung to it like a lifeline. She doesn't remember me, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible, but she will. The next day, at the courthouse, Lorraine was back in her chambers early. She couldn't sleep, and it showed in the slight shadows under her eyes. As she reviewed her docket for the day, her assistant knocked lightly on the door and entered with a hesitant smile. Judge Parker, there's someone here to see you, she said. Mrs. Turner. She says it's about Elijah's case. Lorraine straightened, her pulse quickening. Send her in. Mrs. Turner entered, carrying a thick folder and looking just as tired as Lorraine felt. She sat down across from the judge and placed the folder on the desk. I've been digging, Mrs. Turner began, her tone low but serious. Something about this case doesn't sit right with me. I thought I'd do a little more research, and I found something you might want to see. Lorraine raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt as Mrs. Turner opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. This is an old report from when Elijah first entered foster care, Mrs. Turner said, sliding the top paper across the desk. It mentions that his mother disappeared under strange circumstances, but what caught my attention was this. She pointed to a note scribbled in the margin. It was dated years ago and barely legible, but the words were clear enough. Asterisk possible link to sealed case file asterisk. Lorraine's breath hitched. Sealed case file? She echoed, her mind racing. Mrs. Turner nodded. I checked with the records office, but I couldn't access it. It's sealed tight, and I don't have the clearance to open it. But it's there. Someone went to great lengths to bury whatever's inside. Lorraine stared at the paper, her heart pounding. A sealed file connected to Elijah's case. What could possibly be in it, and why had it been hidden? She knew accessing it would be difficult, but she also knew she couldn't let this go. Later that afternoon, Lorraine requested a private meeting with the head of the courthouse records department. She presented her case carefully, emphasizing the need to uncover the truth for the sake of Elijah's future. After much hesitation, the clerk agreed to grant her access to the sealed file. When the file arrived, Lorraine opened it with a mix of trepidation and determination. Inside were documents, reports, and photos, pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet fit together. But one thing stood out, a birth certificate. She pulled it out, her hands trembling slightly. The name on the certificate sent a chill down her spine. Asterisk Elijah Parker asterisk. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. The date of birth matched Elijah's records, and the mother's name was listed as asterisk Lorraine Parker asterisk. She stared at the paper, her mind reeling. How was this possible? How could she not remember? Was this some kind of mistake? Or had someone deliberately erased this part of her life? But before she could fully process the implications, there was a knock at her door. She quickly shoved the papers back into the file and composed herself. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. The door opened and Mrs. Turner stepped inside. "Judge Parker, I just wanted to check in. Did you find anything?" Lorraine hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't share what she had found, not yet. "I'm still reviewing everything," she said carefully, "but I'll let you know as soon as I have something concrete." Mrs. Turner nodded, her expression a mix of hope and concern. "I just want to make sure Elijah gets the answers he deserves." As the door closed behind Mrs. Turner, Lorraine leaned back in her chair, the weight of the sealed file pressing down on her. She knew she had uncovered something significant, something that could change everything. But for now, she had more questions than answers, and the one person who might hold the key to the truth was the boy who had stood in her courtroom and called her mom. The city felt colder that evening, or maybe it was just Lorraine's thoughts clouding her senses as she drove home. The sealed file rested in her briefcase on the passenger seat, its contents weighing heavier on her mind with every mile. She kept replaying the image of the birth certificate in her head. Elijah Parker, her name listed as his mother. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. And yet, deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that it might be true. Back at her apartment, Lorraine poured herself a cup of tea, though she barely touched it. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the file, trying to summon the courage to open it again. The questions swirling in her mind were relentless. Had someone kept this from her? Was there a part of her past she had forgotten or been forced to forget? Every time she thought she had built a logical argument against the possibility, Elijah's face would flash in her mind. His eyes. His words. Asterisk. "You promised you'd find me." Asterisk. She opened the file once more, flipping through the pages methodically. There were hospital records, some barely legible, but one stood out, a discharge summary dated just after Elijah's birth. It listed Lorraine Parker as the mother, but something was off. Under the section for next of kin, there was no entry, only a hastily drawn line across the space. A note scribbled in the margins read, Asterisk infant placed in emergency care due to maternal incapacitation. Asterisk. Maternal incapacitation. Lorraine frowned, her fingers gripping the edge of the paper. What did that mean? She had no memory of being in any hospital at the time, let alone giving birth. Yet here it was, in black and white. She needed answers, and there was only one place she could think to start. The next morning, Lorraine called in a favor from an old friend who worked in the medical field. Together, they tracked down the hospital where the records originated. By mid-afternoon, she was walking through the sterile halls of a place she didn't recognize but felt a strange unease being in. The staff directed her to the archives, where she met a gray-haired clerk who looked at her with a mix of curiosity and caution. "You're looking for records this old?" the clerk asked, flipping through a large ledger. "We don't get many requests for cases like this. Most of these files have been digitized or discarded." Lorraine nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's related to a case I'm handling. I just need to confirm some details." The clerk disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a thin, dusty file. She handed it to Lorraine, who took it with trembling hands. The file contained only a few pages, but what was there made Lorraine's stomach churn. There was a detailed report of a woman, listed as Lorraine Parker, brought in after a severe accident. She had suffered a concussion and temporary memory loss. The report mentioned that she had been pregnant at the time of the accident and had delivered the baby via emergency C-section. Due to her incapacitation, the infant had been placed in state custody as a precautionary measure. Lorraine's hands shook as she read the final line of the report. Asterisk, patient discharged with no memory of the event. Child's placement finalized. Case closed. Asterisk. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. It was all there. The accident, the memory loss, the baby she never knew she had. Elijah wasn't mistaken. He was her son. But why hadn't anyone told her? Why had the records been sealed? And why had no one ever tried to reunite them? As she left the hospital, her mind raced with the implications. Someone had made the decision to keep Elijah away from her, to hide the truth. Was it the hospital, the state, or someone closer to her? The more she thought about it, the more the pieces refused to fit neatly together. When she arrived home, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Mrs. Turner. Asterisk, Elijah is asking to see you. Can we arrange something? Asterisk. Lorraine stared at the message, her heart pounding. She wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. She didn't know what she would say or how she could explain the truth, but she also knew she couldn't avoid him forever. Later that evening, Lorraine sat in her living room, the sealed file spread out on the coffee table. She was going through the papers again when a memory surfaced, faint and fleeting, but enough to make her pause. She remembered sitting in a car, a storm raging outside, and someone telling her to hold on. Then there was the sound of shattering glass and everything going black. The memory was so vivid it made her gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm what she already knew deep down. The accident had been real, and so had everything that came after. The next day, Lorraine requested a meeting with the state's foster care director. She needed answers, and she wasn't leaving without them. The director, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, looked surprised to see her but agreed to talk. "I'm here about Elijah Carter," Lorraine said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I need to know why his case was mishandled, why I was never informed about my own child." The director frowned, shuffling through papers on his desk. "Judge Parker, I don't understand. Are you saying you believe Elijah Carter is your biological son?" "I don't just believe it," she said firmly. "I've seen the evidence. What I don't understand is why it was hidden from me." The director hesitated, his expression shifting to something closer to guilt. "That case, it's complicated," he said carefully. "There were decisions made at the time that might not have been standard." "Not standard." Lorraine's voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. "A child was taken from me, and I was never even told he existed. How is that remotely acceptable?" The director sighed, leaning back in his chair. "There was pressure to close the case quickly. You were incapacitated, and the system was overwhelmed. Someone decided it was easier to place the child and seal the records." Lorraine felt her chest tighten. Easier for who? Certainly not for Elijah. Or for me. He looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Judge Parker. I truly am, but at this point, the damage is done." Lorraine stood, her hands trembling with rage. "This isn't over," she said quietly but with determination. As she left the office, her resolve hardened. She wasn't just going to get answers. She was going to make things right, for herself and for Elijah. But as she prepared for the next steps, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover, and the truth would come at a cost she wasn't yet prepared to face. Lorraine spent the next few days poring over every scrap of information she could find about Elijah's placement. She reached out to old contacts, filed requests for additional records, and even revisited the sealed file for anything she might have missed. The further she dug, the more she uncovered discrepancies in how Elijah's case had been handled. Documents that should have existed were missing, timelines didn't align, and decisions seemed to have been rushed through without proper oversight. It wasn't just negligence. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this buried. One evening, while reviewing notes at her kitchen table, Lorraine's phone rang. It was Mrs. Turner, her voice low and filled with urgency. "Judge Parker, we need to talk. I've found something troubling." Lorraine agreed to meet her at the foster agency, arriving just as the last of the staff were leaving for the day. Mrs. Turner was waiting in her office, a folder spread out in front of her. She looked up as Lorraine entered, her expression serious. "I've been looking into Elijah's case history," Mrs. Turner began, motioning for Lorraine to sit, "and I came across something I think you need to see." She handed over a document, and Lorraine's eyes scanned the page. It was a transfer form for Elijah's initial placement in foster care, dated shortly after his birth. But what caught her attention was the name listed under the requesting authority. It wasn't the hospital or a social worker, it was a law firm. And the name of the attorney handling the case made Lorraine's blood run cold. It was someone she knew. Someone she had worked with years ago when she was a young attorney. The name leaped off the page like a ghost from her past. Richard Gaines. Richard had been a mentor of sorts during her early years in law, but their relationship had soared after she discovered he was involved in unethical practices. She had distanced herself from him completely, but seeing his name now felt like a cruel twist of fate. "Richard Gaines," Lorraine said aloud, her voice laced with disbelief. "What would he have to do with Elijah?" Mrs. Turner shook her head. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. From what I can tell, he was involved in placing Elijah into foster care, but I can't find any reason why. It's not typical for a private attorney to handle a case like this unless there's something unusual going on." Lorraine felt a chill creep down her spine. Richard's involvement was no coincidence. He had a reputation for bending the law to suit his clients, and if he had been involved in Elijah's case, it meant there was likely more to the story than anyone realized. That night, Lorraine couldn't sleep. Memories of her time working with Richard came flooding back. Late nights in the office, heated arguments over ethics, and finally, the confrontation that ended their professional relationship. He had accused her of being naive, of not understanding how the system really worked. Now she wondered if he had been right, if she had missed something back then that was coming back to haunt her now. The next day, Lorraine decided to confront Richard directly. She tracked him down to his office, a sleek building in the heart of the city. The receptionist looked startled when Lorraine walked in, demanding to see him. "I'm sorry, Judge Parker, but Mr. Gaines is in a meeting," the receptionist began, but Lorraine cut her off. "Tell him it's about Elijah Carter," she said firmly. Moments later, Richard appeared in the lobby, his face a mask of controlled surprise. He greeted Lorraine with a forced smile and led her into his office. As soon as the door closed, his demeanor shifted. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You know why I'm here," Lorraine said, refusing to sit. "I want to know why your name is all over Elijah Carter's case file." Richard raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Elijah Carter. I'm afraid I don't know who you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Lorraine snapped. "I saw the documents. You were involved in placing him in foster care after his birth. Why? What were you trying to hide?" Richard's expression hardened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then with a slow exhale, he leaned forward, his tone dropping to something colder. "Lorraine, you don't understand the full picture here," he said. "Sometimes decisions have to be made for the greater good. Not everyone is cut out to raise a child, especially not someone in your situation at the time." "My situation?" Lorraine repeated, her voice rising. You mean the accident that left me with memory loss? That wasn't your decision to make. You were vulnerable, Richard said, his tone matter of fact. You had no family, no support system. The child needed stability, and I ensured he got it. Lorraine stared at him, disbelief and fury churning inside her. You had no right. You stole my child from me. Richard's gaze didn't waver. I made a decision that I believed was in everyone's best interest, and I'd do it again. Lorraine clenched her fists, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew it wouldn't get her anywhere. Richard was skilled at deflection, and he clearly believed he had done nothing wrong. As she left his office, Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was hiding even more than he had admitted. She was going to expose it. His involvement wasn't just about placing Elijah in foster care. It was about control, about ensuring she never found out the truth. And if he had gone to such lengths to cover his tracks, it meant the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. Lorraine knew she was getting closer to the heart of the mystery, but she also knew the closer she got, the more dangerous it would become. This wasn't just about her or Elijah anymore. It was about uncovering a web of deceit that had been spun years ago, and she wasn't going to stop until she unraveled it all. Lorraine didn't waste any time after her confrontation with Richard. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but she needed undeniable proof to confront him, and more importantly, to make sure Elijah would never be caught in the middle of something so twisted again. She filed an urgent request to reopen Elijah's case records, citing potential legal and ethical violations. The process was slow, but she was determined not to let the system brush her aside. One night, while waiting for a call from her legal contacts, Lorraine decided to revisit the sealed file again. Something about the transfer form gnawed at her, something she couldn't put her finger on until now. The signature at the bottom of the page, faint and slightly smudged, didn't belong to Richard. It was someone else's. She enlarged the scanned image on her laptop and stared at it for several minutes before the realization hit her like a wave. It was her own signature. Her hands trembled as she pulled up old court filings and legal documents to compare the handwriting. There was no doubt about it. The signature on the transfer form matched hers perfectly, but she had no memory of signing it. The date on the document was just days after her accident, during the time she had been unconscious in the hospital. Someone had forged her signature to make it look as though she had consented to Elijah's placement. The weight of the discovery left her reeling. Richard wasn't just complicit. He had orchestrated everything. He had taken advantage of her incapacitated state to erase her connection to Elijah and ensure that she would never know the truth. Lorraine's anger simmered as she realized how deeply she had been betrayed, but beneath it all was a sense of heartbreak. She had lost years with her son because of someone else's calculated deceit. With this new evidence, Lorraine filed a motion to have Elijah's case reviewed by an independent judge. She also reported Richard to the state bar for ethics violations, though she knew it might take months or even years for those charges to stick. What mattered now was Elijah, and proving to him and herself that she hadn't abandoned him. The courtroom was packed when the hearing finally arrived. Reporters lined the back rows, drawn by the shocking twists in the case of the boy who had called the judge his mom. Lorraine sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Across the aisle, Richard sat with his own counsel, his face a mask of indifference. The judge presiding over the case listened intently as Lorraine presented her findings. The forged signature, the sealed records, and the hospital report all painted a damning picture. Richard's attorney attempted to dismiss the claims as circumstantial, but Lorraine's evidence was airtight. The courtroom fell silent as the judge leaned forward and asked Richard directly, "Did you falsify these documents to facilitate the placement of Elijah Carter into foster care?" Richard hesitated for the first time, his confident facade cracking under the weight of the evidence. "I did what I believed was necessary at the time," he said finally, his voice tight. Lorraine wasn't in a position to care for a child. "I thought I was protecting both of them." The judge's expression darkened. "You took it upon yourself to make a decision that was not yours to make. You manipulated the system and deprived a mother of her right to raise her child. This court does not condone such actions." Lorraine felt a swell of vindication as the judge declared that Elijah's records would be amended and his placement reevaluated. But the victory was bittersweet. No ruling could erase the years she and Elijah had lost. After the hearing, Lorraine waited outside the courthouse, her heart pounding as she spotted Elijah walking toward her with Mrs. Turner. His small frame seemed even smaller in the large crowd, but his face was lit with cautious hope. When he reached her, he looked up with those same piercing eyes that had haunted her dreams. "Is it true?" he asked softly. "Are you really my mom?" Lorraine knelt down, tears welling in her eyes as she took his hands in hers. "Yes, Elijah," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm your mom. I always have been." Elijah's lip quivered as he threw his arms around her, and Lorraine held him tightly, as if letting go would mean losing him all over again. The moment felt surreal, but it was real, and it was theirs. As the crowd began to disperse, Lorraine felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a young woman holding an envelope. "This was delivered to the foster agency yesterday," the woman said. "It's addressed to you." Lorraine took the envelope, her brow furrowing as she recognized the handwriting. It was from Richard. She opened it cautiously, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The note was short and cryptic. Asterisk, "There are things you don't know. Look deeper if you dare." Asterisk. A cold shiver ran through her as she realized Richard wasn't just trying to absolve himself. He was hinting at something else entirely, something bigger. The revelation of Elijah's case was only the beginning, and Lorraine knew that whatever lay ahead would test her strength and resolve even more. As she looked down at Elijah, his small hand in hers, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had fought to uncover the truth, and she would fight to protect him from whatever secrets still lurked in the shadows. This was just the beginning of their story, and she was ready for whatever came next.